The gentle glow of a desk lamp cast long shadows across Judge Frank Caprio's mahogany desk as he settled into his evening routine. At 76, these quiet moments had become precious, a time to reflect on the day's cases and prepare for tomorrow's docket. The grandfather clock in the corner of his Providence home study chimed 9 times, its familiar sound mixing with the soft rustle of legal papers. His phone buzzed against the wooden desk, screen illuminating with a message from his grandson, Antonio. "Grandpa, you need to see this. It's happening again." Attached was a video link, already trending across multiple social media platforms. Caprio adjusted his reading glasses, his weathered fingers tapping the screen with practiced precision. The video quality was sharp, likely recorded that morning in a courtroom somewhere in the Midwest. The scene unfolded with an almost theatrical cruelty. A black woman, perhaps in her early 30s, stood before a raised bench, her postal worker uniform wrinkled from what had clearly been a long shift. Her hands, trembling slightly, clutched a stack of creased papers, pay stubs, bills, and what appeared to be children's medical records. "Your Honor," her voice wavered, thick with emotion, but maintaining dignity. "I understand I was wrong for the rolling stop, but I'm asking for some mercy with the fine." She shuffled through her papers, each movement betraying increasing desperation. "I have 3 children at home. Their father passed last year from COVID, and I'm all they have. I can show you." The white judge, a man whose expression remained as immobile as the marble pillars behind him, cut her off mid-sentence. His voice carried the practiced boredom of someone who had stopped listening long ago. "The fine is $250, Miss Thompson. The law doesn't care about your personal circumstances." Caprio felt his chest tighten. In his 4 decades on the bench, he'd developed an almost sixth sense for detecting the moment when justice tilted away from its true purpose. This was one of those moments. The woman, Ms. Thompson, according to her citation, wasn't finished. She pulled out another document, her hands shaking more visibly now. "Sir, I'm working 3 jobs. Here's proof of my shifts. If I pay this all at once, I won't have enough for groceries this week. My youngest, she has asthma. And her inhaler." "Ms. Thompson," the judge interrupted again, his tone sharpening. "This is a court of law, not a charity. The fine stands at $250, due by the end of business today, or a warrant will be issued. Next case." The video captured what happened next in excruciating detail. Miss Thompson's shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had faced this kind of dismissal too many times before. A tear rolled down her cheek, quickly wiped away with the sleeve of her uniform. As she turned to leave, the camera caught her whispering a prayer, her lips moving silently. Caprio found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He rewound the video and watched it again. And again, each viewing revealed new details. The family photo peeking out of Miss Thompson's wallet as she tucked away her papers, the wedding ring she still wore, the dark circles under her eyes suggesting nights spent working instead of sleeping. His mind raced back to 1929, to a story his father had told him countless times. His father, an Italian immigrant, stood before a judge much like the one in the video, trying to explain in broken English why he couldn't pay a fine. The judge had mockingly imitated his accent, drawing laughs from the courtroom. That story had shaped Caprio's entire approach to justice, but here, decades later, the same scene was playing out again. The grandfather clock struck 10, then 11, but Caprio barely noticed. He'd moved to his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard as he searched for more information about the case. His email to his law clerk, marked URGNT, went out just before midnight. Find out everything you can about Lisa Thompson's case, where it happened, who the judge was, and most importantly, find out if anyone's reaching out to help her. As he finally prepared for bed, Caprio caught his reflection in his office window. The face looking back at him wasn't just that of a judge anymore. It was the face of someone about to break his usual silence about fellow judges, Something had to change, and he knew, with the certainty that came from decades on the bench, that he would have to be the one to start it. The video had shattered more than just his evening routine. It had shattered his conviction that progress in judicial compassion was inevitable. Tomorrow would bring decisions, actions, and quite possibly controversy. But for tonight, Judge Frank Caprio sat with his anger, his sadness, and most importantly, his determination to ensure that Lisa Thompson's tears would not fall in vain. Sleep eluded Judge Caprio that night. The digital clock on his desk blinked 2:17 a.m. as he pulled open the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, disturbing decades of carefully preserved memories. His hands, usually steady in the courtroom, trembled slightly as they brushed against a leather-bound album he hadn't opened in years. The photograph he sought was tucked behind a protective sleeve, its edges yellowed with age. Providence, 1929. His father, Vincenzo Caprio, stood on the courthouse steps, pride and uncertainty warring on his face. The image was taken the day he'd finally become a U.S. citizen, but it was another day, one not captured on film, that consumed Frank's thoughts tonight. They laughed at him, Frank whispered to the empty study, his voice thick with emotion. He could still hear his father's voice, describing that day in court, the memory as clear as if it were yesterday. Vincenzo, then a fruit peddler trying to support 6 children, had received a fine for his cart being too close to the curb. $50. The words had stumbled out of Vincenzo's mouth in broken English, the amount representing nearly 2 weeks' earnings. Per favor, Your Honor, my bambini. The judge had mockingly repeated his words, drawing laughter from the courthouse gallery. The shame of that moment had lived in Vincenzo's eyes every time he recounted the story. A soft ping from his computer drew Caprio back to the present. His law clerk, Sarah Chen, was apparently also burning the midnight oil. Her email contained preliminary findings about Lisa Thompson's case. Judge Caprio, the email began, Ms. Thompson's hearing took place in Marion County, Indiana. She's 34, widowed last year when her husband died from COVID complications. 3 children, Marcus, 12, Lily, 9, and Amara, 6. Former registered nurse who lost her license after missing too many shifts caring for her dying mother. Currently works as a postal worker during the day, stock clerk in the evenings, and weekend shifts at a gas station. Caprio's throat tightened as he read on. The similarities to his father's story were almost painful. Different decades, different circumstances, but the same fundamental struggle. People trying to maintain their dignity in a system that too often saw them as mere case numbers. He pulled up the viral video again, this time focusing on details he'd missed before. The judge's nameplate, Honorable Richard Maxwell. The way the court officers shifted uncomfortably during the exchange. The young public defender who seemed to be fighting the urge to speak up. His phone buzzed. Another email from Sarah. Found something else. Ms. Thompson volunteers at the Bread of Life shelter every Sunday, her only day off. The citation was issued while she was rushing from the post office to her evening job. Rolling stop at a deserted intersection at 4:47 p.m. Caprio pushed back from his desk, moving to the window. Providence's city lights twinkled below, a sight that usually brought him peace. Tonight, they only reminded him of all the lights still burning in homes where people lay awake worrying about fines they couldn't pay, jobs they might lose, children they struggled to feed. He returned to his desk and pulled out a legal pad, beginning to write with the intensity that had characterized his 4 decades on the bench. By the time dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, he had filled several pages with notes, ideas, and most importantly, a plan. Sarah arrived at 7 a.m., carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking like she hadn't slept much either. She found her boss still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by old case files, historical documents about judicial bias, and printouts of court reform initiatives from across the country. "Judge," she said, placing a coffee on his desk. "Good morning, America called." They want to interview you about your viral court show episodes. Should I tell them you're not available?" Caprio looked up, his eyes bright despite his exhaustion. "No," he said firmly. "Schedule it. But tell them I have something specific I want to discuss." He held up the photograph of his father alongside a screenshot from the viral video. "It's time we talk about how little has changed and what we're going to do about it." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. As she turned to leave, she paused. "Your father would be proud, you know." Caprio touched the old photograph gently. "Perhaps," he said quietly. "But more importantly, I hope Ms. Thompson's children will live to see a different kind of justice than she experienced. That's what matters now." The morning sun finally broke through the study's windows, illuminating the scattered papers, the old photographs, and the face of a judge who had decided that silence was no longer an option. The bright lights of ABC's Good Morning America studio felt unusually harsh that morning. Judge Frank Caprio sat in the guest chair, his normally perfect Windsor knot slightly askew, a small tell of his sleepless night. The makeup artist had done her best to conceal the dark circles under his eyes, but nothing could hide the weight of purpose that sat squarely on his shoulders. And we're back with Judge Frank Caprio, whose compassionate courtroom moments have captured hearts across America. Robin Roberts began, her warm smile putting him at ease. "Your videos of showing mercy to those in need have gone viral multiple times. But today, you wanted to discuss something specific." Caprio nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The studio lights seemed to blur as he focused on the moment he'd been preparing for. "Yes, Robin, there's another video that's been circulating. Not from my courtroom, but one that I believe demands our attention." The production team played the clip of Lisa Thompson's hearing. The studio fell silent as her plea echoed through the speakers, followed by Judge Maxwell's cold dismissal. When the clip ended, Robin turned back to Caprio, but the words caught in her throat. Judge Caprio, the man known for his composed demeanor and gentle wisdom, was crying. "I apologize," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached for his pocket square, but fumbled it. Robin quietly handed him a tissue. "You see, 70 years ago, my father stood in a courtroom just like Miss Thompson." His voice cracked. He was an immigrant fruit peddler, trying to feed 6 children. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of this unscripted moment. A tear rolled down his cheek as he pulled out the weathered photograph of his father. "This system, this justice system we've built, it's supposed to protect people, not break them." The studio remained absolutely still. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. "You know, Robin," he continued, gathering himself, "in 40 years on the bench, I've learned that every person who stands before me is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope for the future. When I saw that video, I didn't just see Miss Thompson. I saw my father. I saw every person who's ever stood in my courtroom, terrified that one moment of bad luck would destroy everything they've worked for." Social media exploded in real time. A hashtag Tears of Justice began trending as clips of the interviews spread across platforms. But Caprio wasn't finished. "We've created a system where a $250 fine means nothing to some and everything to others. Where a judge can look at a working mother, a widow struggling to raise 3 children alone, and say the law doesn't care about your circumstances. Well, maybe the law doesn't care, but we must. We who interpret and apply that law must care." Robin leaned forward. "Judge Caprio, your emotion is palpable. What would you say to Judge Maxwell, who presided over Miss Thompson's case?" Caprio straightened in his chair, his tears now dried but his voice carrying a strength that seemed to fill the studio. "I would remind him of the oath we both took. We swore to administer justice with mercy. Mercy isn't weakness. It's the strength to see beyond the letter of the law to its spirit. It's understanding that true justice must be tempered with compassion, or it isn't justice at all." The interview continued for several more minutes, but that moment, the sight of a respected judge moved to tears by another suffering, became the clip that would be shared millions of times in the hours and days to come. As Caprio left the studio, his phone buzzed continuously with messages from judges across the country. Some offered support. Others criticized him for breaking the unwritten code of judicial solidarity. But it was one message that stopped him in his tracks, a text from an unknown number. Judge Caprio, this is Lisa Thompson. I saw your interview. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for understanding. My children and I have been praying for someone to hear us. In the back of the car heading to his next appointment, Caprio typed out a response with trembling fingers. Miss Thompson, thank you for your courage. Your story isn't over. And neither is our fight for change. He looked out the window at the passing city streets, knowing that his emotional display on national television had just changed everything. There would be consequences, both personal and professional. But as his father had taught him long ago, some prices are worth paying when you're standing up for what's right. The revolution in judicial compassion had begun with tears on national television. Now came the hard part, turning those tears into lasting change. The newsroom of the Indianapolis Star hummed with energy as veteran reporter Maya Rodriguez hunched over her desk, surrounded by stacks of documents. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in the intensity of her investigation into Lisa Thompson's story. Her editor had given her carte blanche after Judge Caprio's emotional GMA appearance went viral. Get me everything, he'd said. The whole damn story. Your nursing license suspension hearing is scheduled for June 15, 2023. Maya read aloud from a document, her finger tracing the lines. Grounds for review. Repeated unauthorized absences. She paused, pulling up another document on her screen. A hospice admission form for one Dorothy Williams, Lisa Thompson's mother. The dates aligned perfectly. Her phone buzzed. A text from a source at Marion General Hospital. Found something. Thompson wasn't just missing shifts. She was working double shifts on alternate days to make up for the time she needed to be with her mother. The supervisor knew. Turned a blind eye until Joint Commission audit. Maya's hands flew across her keyboard, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Lisa Thompson hadn't simply abandoned her duties. She'd been desperately trying to balance them, working 20-hour shifts to compensate for the time spent at her mother's bedside. The hospital had unofficially accommodated her until an audit forced them to discover the irregularities. A knock on her cubicle wall startled her. Jim, the paper's photographer, held up his camera. Got those pictures you wanted from the homeless shelter. The images loaded onto her computer. Lisa Thompson in a worn Beatles t-shirt and jeans, serving breakfast to shelter residents. Her youngest daughter, Amara, carefully arranging donated clothes on shelves. Another showed Lisa checking an elderly man's blood pressure, still using her nursing skills even after losing her license. She's been volunteering there every Sunday for 3 years, Jim said quietly. Before her husband died, they did it as a family. Now she brings the kids. The shelter director says she's never missed a shift, even after everything. Maya nodded, adding notes to her already extensive file. Her investigation had revealed a life defined by service and sacrifice. Marcus, Lisa's 12-year-old, had started waking up at 4 a.m. to help his younger sisters get ready for school so their mom could work the early postal route. Lily, the middle child, had learned to manage her sister Amara's asthma medications, keeping meticulous charts of when each dose was due. The next document in her stack was the accident report from the day of the traffic stop. A rolling stop at 4:47 p.m., rushing between jobs. The officer's body cam footage showed Lisa already in her gas station uniform, her postal worker badge still pinned to her shirt. Maya's phone rang, her source at the courthouse. "You're not going to believe this," the voice said. "Remember how Thompson asked for a payment plan? Turns out Judge Maxwell approved one for a white defendant just 20 minutes earlier. Same violation, same circumstances, different outcome. I'm sending you the transcript." The reporter's hands shook as she opened the email. There it was in black and white. Maxwell granting leniency to another defendant, even joking about traffic cameras being too strict. The contrast was stark, damning. As Maya began drafting her article, a new email arrived from Lisa Thompson herself, agreeing to an interview. The message was time-stamped 2:13 a.m., sent during her break at the gas station. The interview took place the next morning at a small diner near the post office. Lisa looked exhausted, but carried herself with quiet dignity. She spoke of her husband's battle with COVID, of holding her mother's hand as she passed, of the daily challenge of keeping her children's hopes alive while their world crumbled around them. "I don't want revenge," Lisa said, stirring her untouched coffee. "I just want change. My kids, they see everything. They watch how the system treats people like us. I want them to believe in justice again." Maya's article, titled Beyond the Viral Video, The Real Story of Lisa Thompson, was published the next day. It spread even faster than the original courtroom video, painting a portrait not just of one woman's struggle, but of a system that too often confused punishment with justice. By sunset, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Lisa's phone started ringing with interview requests from major networks. But she was too busy to answer. It was Sunday, and the homeless shelter was expecting her. "Some things don't change," she told Maya in a brief text. "My mother taught me that service to others is the rent we pay for living. No judge can take that away from me." Judge Caprio's courtroom in Providence had never seen a morning quite like this. Instead of the usual gallery of defendants, 30 judges from across the country filled the benches, their formal black robes creating a sea of solemnity. They'd come, some skeptical and others hopeful, to witness what the New York Times had dubbed the Caprio method in action. "What you're about to see isn't revolutionary," Caprio addressed his colleagues, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years' experience. "It's simply justice remembering its humanity." He nodded to the bailiff. First case. A young man in a mechanic's uniform, his hand still bearing traces of engine grease, approached the bench. The citation was for an expired registration, 3 months overdue. Before the man could speak, Caprio noticed his hands trembling. "Son," Caprio said gently, "tell me what's happening in your life right now." The story tumbled out. The man's wife had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Medical bills had consumed their savings. Their 2-year-old daughter's daycare fees, the cost of medications, the choice between paying for registration or chemotherapy. Each detail painted a picture of impossible choices. The visiting judges watched as Caprio leaned forward, removing his glasses. "Show me your registration." The man produced a paper, dated yesterday. He'd borrowed money to renew it before coming to court. "I see responsibility here," Caprio announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "I see a man doing everything he can to follow the law while facing circumstances most of us pray we'll never experience." He turned to his fellow judges. "The question isn't whether he broke the law. He did. The question is what purpose justice serves by punishing him further." Case dismissed. The mechanic broke down in tears. Throughout the morning, case after case revealed similar stories. A single mother who couldn't pay her parking tickets because her autistic son's therapy had doubled in cost. An elderly veteran living on a fixed income who'd failed to update his driver's license after being hospitalized for a stroke. Each time, Caprio demonstrated how justice could be both upheld and humanized. During the lunch break, Judge Maria Hernandez from Texas approached Caprio in his chambers. "Frank, I was skeptical when I came here," she admitted. "I thought you were just playing to the cameras. But what you're doing, it's not just mercy. It's better justice." Caprio smiled, pulling out a thick folder. "I've been keeping records," he said, spreading out statistics across his desk. "In jurisdictions that have adopted similar approaches, fine collection rates have actually increased. When people feel seen and respected, when they're given manageable ways to make things right, they're more likely to meet their obligations." The afternoon session introduced something new. Caprio had invited social workers and community resource representatives into the courtroom. As each case was heard, immediate connections were made to relevant services, job training programs, healthcare resources, childcare assistance, veteran support services. The law isn't just about punishment, Caprio explained to his colleagues. It's about maintaining social order. Sometimes the best way to do that is to help people get back on their feet. The day's final case struck a particularly powerful chord. A postal worker, like Lisa Thompson, stood before the bench, cited for a traffic violation. The visiting judges straightened in their seats, the parallel unmistakable. Caprio handled the case with his usual grace, but afterward he addressed his colleagues one last time. Today you've seen 37 cases. Each one represented a choice, to see the law as a weapon or as a tool for positive change. Every person who stood before us today will go home and tell their children about what happened in court. What lesson do we want them to learn? As the judges filed out, many were already on their phones, calling their clerks to implement changes. Judge Hernandez stayed behind. "We need to make this official," she said. "Training programs, guidelines, support systems. This can't just be the Caprio method. It needs to become the standard method." Caprio nodded, pulling out one last document. A proposal for a National Judicial Compassion Initiative. "I was hoping someone would say that," he smiled, because Lisa Thompson wasn't just one case. She was a wake-up call. "And now that we're awake, we have to act," Hernandez finished. That evening, as Caprio prepared to leave his chambers, his clerk handed him a stack of emails. 57 judges requesting to observe his court next week. The revolution wasn't just beginning. It was spreading. He glanced at the photo of his father, still sitting on his desk. "See, Papa," he whispered. "Sometimes it takes a lifetime to fix one moment of injustice, but we're finally getting there." The American Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. buzzed with tension. Judge Richard Maxwell sat in the front row, arms crossed, his face set in stone as Judge Caprio approached the podium. The large conference hall was packed with over 300 judges, their opinions on the Caprio method dividing them as visibly as the center aisle. "Colleagues," Caprio began, his voice steady despite the palpable hostility from some quarters. "Before I present my data, I'd like to share a number. 78. That's how many people have taken their own lives in the past year due to court-imposed financial burdens they couldn't bear." Maxwell stood up, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is emotional manipulation, Frank. We're not social workers. We're judges. The law," Caprio interrupted, unusually sharp, "is killing people, Richard. And we're wielding it." The tension crackled. Security officers shifted nervously at the doors, but Caprio was already moving to his presentation, slides filling the giant screen behind him. "Marion County, Indiana," he continued, looking directly at Maxwell. "After implementing flexible payment plans and ability-to-pay hearings, fine collection rates increased by 42%. Salt Lake City, 38% increase. Providence, 51%. Each statistic appeared on screen, backed by graphs and official data. But that's not all. Caprio clicked to the next slide. Repeat offense rates dropped by an average of 35% across jurisdictions using compassionate justice approaches. When people feel the system works with them, rather than against them, they become more invested in following the law. Maxwell stood again. "And what about deterrence? What about consequences?" Caprio smiled sadly. "I was hoping you'd ask." He gestured to the back of the hall, where Lisa Thompson stood up, now wearing a business suit instead of her postal uniform. "Miss Thompson, would you say the experience in Judge Maxwell's courtroom deterred you from future violations?" Lisa's voice carried clearly. "No, Your Honor. It taught my children that justice depends on your race and bank account. The only thing it deterred was their faith in the system." Maxwell's face flushed red. "This is inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" boomed a voice from the side door. "Is a system that perpetuates poverty in the name of justice. Heads turned as Chief Justice Roberts himself walked into the hall. The room erupted in whispers before falling into stunned silence. "Please continue, Judge Caprio," Roberts said, taking the seat. "The Supreme Court is very interested in your findings." For the next hour, Caprio presented a comprehensive analysis of compassionate justice practices. He showed body camera footage comparing outcomes between demographic groups, presented psychological studies on the impact of punitive versus rehabilitative approaches, and shared letters from law enforcement officials supporting the new methods. "We're not suggesting abandoning the law," Caprio emphasized. "We're suggesting applying it with wisdom. Every time we turn a traffic ticket into a life sentence of poverty, we create ripples of dysfunction that cost society far more than the fine we're trying to collect." Maxwell made one last stand. "This is the kind of soft approach that encourages lawlessness. Next, you'll suggest we apologize to criminals for arresting them." The Chief Justice cleared his throat. "Judge Maxwell, would you approach the podium?" Maxwell walked forward, straightening his tie. "Please read this." Roberts handed him a paper. Maxwell's voice shook as he read. "Notice of Judicial Review. In the matter of discriminatory sentencing patterns." He stopped, face pale. "Your courtroom records show systematically harsher treatment of minorities and low-income defendants," Roberts stated. "This isn't about being soft or hard on crime. It's about equal justice under law." Words carved into the very facade of our highest court. The room sat in shocked silence. Caprio returned to the podium. "We're not here to shame anyone. We're here to do better. I'm proposing a nationwide training program with clear guidelines for ability-to-pay hearings and a database of community resources for every jurisdiction." He pulled out his father's old photograph. 70 years ago, my father stood before a judge who chose mockery over mercy. Today, we can choose differently. We can choose to be the justice system America needs, not just the one it has inherited. The Chief Justice stood. "All in favor?" Hands rose across the room. Slowly at first, then in waves. Even Maxwell, after a long moment, raised his hand. As the session adjourned, Lisa Thompson approached Caprio. "Thank you," she said simply. "No," he replied, watching his colleagues file out, many already on phones scheduling training sessions. "Thank you for being brave enough to let your pain become our wake-up call." The revolution wasn't just spreading anymore. It had just become policy. The congressional hearing room hummed with anticipation. C-SPAN cameras panned across the chamber as Lisa Thompson adjusted her microphone, her hand steady now, unlike that day in traffic court. Behind her sat a coalition that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Civil rights attorneys, conservative judges, social workers, and law enforcement officials, all united under a banner that read Justice and Dignity Act. "Ms. Thompson," Senator Elizabeth Warren leaned forward. "Walk us through what happened after that viral video." Lisa glanced at Judge Caprio, who sat supportively in the gallery, before beginning. "The fine wasn't just $250, she explained. "It was my dignity. My children's dinner. Their faith in the system. But something unexpected happened. It became a catalyst for change." She gestured to the thick binder before her. "In the past 6 months, we've documented over 10,000 similar cases across the country. Working parents choosing between paying traffic fines and buying medications. Veterans missing court dates because they can't afford gas money to get there. Elderly people losing their licenses because they can't pay parking tickets on their fixed incomes." Senator Ted Cruz, typically a hardliner on judicial matters, held up a report. "We have data suggesting that implementing the Caprio method has actually increased fine collection rates while reducing repeat offenses. How do you explain this paradox?" A small smile crossed Lisa's face. "Senator, it's simple. When you treat people with dignity, when you give them achievable paths to make things right, they rise to meet you. My children watched me stand in that courtroom and be dismissed, but they also watched what happened next, how people came together to fix a broken system. The hearing continued as speaker after speaker presented evidence. Police chiefs testify about improved community relations. Court clerks shared statistics showing dramatic drops in default rates. Social workers detailed the positive impacts on families. Then came the moment that would later be called the turning point. Judge Maxwell, who had undergone his own transformation since the judicial conference, took the stand. "I was wrong," he stated simply, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber. "For 30 years, I confused rigidity with righteousness. I forgot that every case number represents a human life, a family, a future." He turned to face Lisa directly. "Miss Thompson, I owe you an apology. And I owe society a better version of justice." The afternoon session focused on the practical details of the Justice and Dignity Act. The legislation would mandate ability to pay hearings, establish flexible payment plans, and create a national database of community resources for courts to utilize. But its most revolutionary aspect was the second look provision, requiring judges to consider the full human impact of their decisions. During a break, Lisa found herself in the hallway with an unexpected visitor. The President's Chief of Staff. "The White House is watching," he said quietly. "The President believes this could be the most significant judicial reform since the Civil Rights Act. Would you be willing to speak at the signing ceremony?" Lisa thought of her children watching from home. "Yes," she replied. "But I have one condition. I want Judge Caprio to stand with me." Back in the hearing room, the final testimonies wrapped up. Senator Warren had one last question for Lisa. "What do you want people to remember about this moment?" Lisa stood, her voice strong and clear. "I want them to remember that justice without compassion isn't justice at all. I want them to remember that one person's suffering, when witnessed by those with the power to change things, can transform a nation." She paused, touching the postal worker badge she still wore proudly. "But mostly, I want my children, and everyone's children, to grow up knowing that the law can see them, hear them, and treat them with dignity regardless of their circumstances." As the hearing concluded, reporters clustered around the coalition members. But Lisa slipped away quietly, checking her watch. She had just enough time to make it to her Sunday shift at the homeless shelter. In the gallery, Judge Caprio watched her go, remembering his father's words about justice and mercy. He noticed Judge Maxwell doing the same, perhaps thinking of his own legacy now being rewritten. The Justice and Dignity Act would pass with bipartisan support 2 weeks later, but the real victory had already been won, in changed hearts, in restored faith, and in the quiet revolution that began with one mother's tears in an Indiana courtroom. "The winds of change," Caprio murmured, gathering his papers, "sometimes start with a single breath of courage." 1 year later, Judge Frank Caprio sat in his chambers, his morning coffee growing cold as he watched a video on his phone. The footage, already trending nationwide, showed a young judge in Austin, Texas, Judge Sarah Martinez, one of the first graduates of the Caprio Method training program. On her courtroom screen was an elderly man's driver's license photo. Unlike the traditional stern formality of traffic court, Martinez had left her elevated bench, pulling a chair to sit at eye level with the 78-year-old defendant, cited for driving with an expired registration. "Mr. Chen," her voice carried the gentle authority that had become the hallmark of the new judicial approach, "I see you've brought all your documents. Would you tell me what's been happening?" The man's story unfolded. A retired teacher living on Social Security, caring for his wife with Alzheimer's. The registration had lapsed during one of her hospital stays. He'd renewed it immediately after receiving the citation, but the fine remained. Martinez nodded, reviewing his paperwork. Then she did something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. She reached for her court directory of community resources, a requirement under the new Justice and Dignity Act. "Sir, are you aware of the Senior Transportation Assistance Program, and that your wife's condition qualifies you for additional home care support?" She spent the next 10 minutes connecting him with vital services, then dismissed the fine, citing his immediate correction of the violation. As Mr. Chen wiped away tears of relief, Comments poured in beneath the viral video. This is what justice looks like. Remember the Lisa Thompson video? Look how far we've come. Proud to live in a country that can learn and grow. Caprio's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa Thompson herself. Judge Caprio, have you seen the news? Just got accepted to law school. Evening program. I'll keep my postal route during the day. The kids insist I can't give up our Sunday shelter volunteering either. He smiled, typing back. Future Judge Thompson has a nice ring to it. His clerk knocked, entering with the morning's cases. Judge, you might want to see this one first. She handed him a folder marked urgent. Inside was a traffic citation for one Richard Maxwell Jr., son of his former judicial adversary. The young man had been caught speeding, rushing his father to the emergency room after a suspected heart attack. Caprio checked his calendar. Maxwell Sr. was scheduled to teach a session on implicit bias at the National Judicial Training Center that afternoon. The transformation of his once staunchest opponent into one of judicial reform's strongest advocates had become legendary. Get me Judge Maxwell on the phone, Caprio instructed his clerk. Within minutes, he learned that his colleague was recovering well. The speed and quick action of his son had made all the difference. Later that morning, as Richard Jr. stood before his bench, Caprio saw an opportunity to demonstrate how far they'd come. Young man, he began, a year ago, this would have been a simple case of speeding. Today, under the Justice and Dignity Act, we're required to consider context. He pulled up the hospital admission records. You broke the law to save your father's life. The question before this court is not whether you speeded. You did, but whether punishment serves justice in this case. He glanced at the gallery, now filled with law students taking notes. The Caprio method had become part of standard law school curriculum nationwide. Case dismissed, he announced. But there's something else. Your father's work in judicial reform this past year has helped countless families. Today, that same system was able to help his family. That's what we mean by justice coming full circle. That evening, Caprio received an email from the National Judicial Review Board. They wanted to feature his courtroom in a documentary about the transformation of American justice. The working title, Tears and Justice, The Lisa Thompson Effect. He clicked over to his video feed of Judge Martinez's courtroom in Texas. She was ending her day the way all judges now did, reviewing her decisions with her judicial mentor via secure video link, ensuring that justice and compassion remained in balance. As he prepared to leave for the day, Caprio paused by his father's photograph. Next to it now hung a framed copy of the Justice and Dignity Act, and beside that, a simple handwritten note from Lisa Thompson's children. Dear Judge Caprio, thank you for helping make justice look more like love. Marcus, Lily, and Amara Thompson. He touched the frame gently. We did it, Papa, he whispered. We finally did it. Outside his window, the Providence sunset painted the sky in shades of hope, while somewhere in a law school library, a postal worker studied late into the night, preparing to carry the torch of compassionate justice into the next generation. The revolution hadn't just succeeded, it had become legacy.